British Prime Minister Boris Johnson wants to abolish the obligation to self-isolate in the event of a positive corona test. Johnson announced a plan for what he calls living with COVID in Parliament in London on Wednesday. Provided the current encouraging trends on the data continue, I expect we can end the last few domestic restrictions, including the legal requirement to self-isolate if you test positive, a full month early, Johnson said. The government has repeatedly made it clear that it wants to put the pandemic situation behind it. The current corona regulation expires on March 24th, so Johnson is suggesting that the remaining rule could end as early as February 23rd. He intends to present his plans on February 21st after the forthcoming break in the meeting for the winter holidays. According to political commentators, the Prime Minister's announcement is intended to win over the hardliners in his Conservative Party. Johnson is under intense pressure within the party for his handling of the Partygate affair. Johnson had already lifted almost all corona rules in England, the largest part of the UK. The obligation to take a corona test no later than the second day after entry ends today. Mask and distance rules had already been ended. Agreeable, willing to provide information and friendly demeanor. At first glance, the young man in the white shirt who testified in the heavily guarded Paris courthouse on Wednesday doesn't look like a violent Islamist. Salah Abdeslam is the main defendant in the trial of the 2015 Islamist terrorist attacks in the French capital, which left 130 dead. His first questioning was eagerly awaited, and Abdeslam talks for hours about the devastating bloodbath on behalf of the terrorist militia Islamic State, or ISIS, which hit France to the core and left behind many traumatized survivors and relatives. For weeks, these witnesses had reported in court about the horror of the attacks, suffering and grief, and the attempt to understand why the massacre with explosive belts and Kalashnikov rifles took place. Why and how can people do this to others? What goes on in the mind of such a perpetrator? These are the questions that were raised in the courtroom on Wednesday, especially created for the trial. Abdeslam is the only survivor of the terror squad that shot 130 people dead and injured 350 in the Bataclan concert hall, as well as in bars and restaurants. Abdeslam is said to have had an explosive belt in Paris, but did not detonate it, instead throwing it away in a suburb where it was later found. I didn't kill anyone, I didn't injure anyone, he says. Well, he says he has changed his mind, but he still faces a heavy penalty. He fears the court wants to make an example of him. Taking responsibility, admitting mistakes, is not what Abdeslam's statement at the start of his questioning by the presiding judge is about. In terms of age, he could be his father and engages in a lengthy political religious discussion with the accused, the attack almost receding into the background. Abdeslam did not express any doubts during his questioning, although he did not detonate his explosive belt, unlike one of his brothers, who was also involved. I am on the side of IS, I love it, he says. The West imposes its values on the rest of the world, setting up military bases in Muslim countries in order to kill Muslims from there, he says. The ISIS is fighting against this. I think that's legitimate, he says. No, I don't think so. The suffering of civilians in the civil war in Syria drove him to IS, and he brushes aside the judge's objection that there's also other resistance to Bashar al-Assad's regime. This is democratic, it's about an Islamic order. During his trip to London, Austria's Finance Minister Magnus Brunner met Rishi Sunak. Sunak, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, as Britain's Finance and Business Secretary is officially known, is traditionally seen as the second most important member of government after the Prime Minister. His official residence is at 11 Downing Street, right next to the world-famous number 10 door, which is the Prime Minister's office. Sunak has been in office since February 2020 and was recently described by the German newspaper Handelsblatt as the shooting star of British politics. He made a name for himself in Great Britain primarily through an economic stimulus package to overcome the corona crisis. My goal as finance minister is to strengthen the capital market and increase everyone's participation in the capital market. London is the second largest financial centre in the world, and even after Brexit, the UK will of course remain an important economic partner for Austria, so it is important to further deepen relations. In addition to the major topic of COVID recovery, I was able to talk to Chancellor Sunak about green finance, the digital tax and economic aid, said Magnus Brunner after the conversation with Rishi Sunak. Green finance, that means green investments and the financing of climate-friendly technologies, is a topic that is keeping us busy throughout Europe, not least because of the debate about the EU Commission's taxonomy regulation. We agree that climate protection is one of the issues of the future and is penetrating all areas of the economy, finance and life. Austria has recently taken a major step by implementing the largest transformation of our tax system in the Second Republic with the eco-social tax reform. We have thus created incentives to behave in a climate-friendly manner. We are taking the next step with the issue of the first green bond, says Brunner. And at the work meeting between Sunak and Brunner, the two finance ministers also exchanged views on the respective corona economic aid. In a European comparison, the economic aid in Austria is very generous, efficient and accurate. I spoke to my British colleague Sunak about this and about ways out of the crisis, as well as about the general economic development of our two countries, says Brunner. A 29-year-old is on trial in Berlin for allegedly planning an Islamist terrorist attack. According to the indictment, the man is said to have pursued specific attack plans in 2019 in order to kill or injure as many as possible. His arrest in November 2019 prevented the crime from being carried out, according to the public prosecutor's office on Wednesday, when the indictment was read out in front of the Berlin Superior Court. They accused the Syrian of preparing a serious act of violence that endangers the state and of financing terrorism. The 29-year-old, dressed completely in dark, calmly followed the reading of the indictment. When asked about himself by the presiding judge, Detlef Schmidt, he only nodded silently. His client will not comment on the allegations, his defense attorney said. The defendant is currently in prison for other crimes. In May 2020, the Berlin Regional Court sentenced him to 3 years and 2 months in prison for instructing him to commit a serious act of violence that was dangerous to the state. The allegations in the current trial partly overlap with those from the final conviction, which already involved instructions and information material on the construction of explosives and weapons. According to earlier information from the authorities, the Syrian entered the country as a refugee in 2014 and received a residence permit. According to the indictment, he has been involved with radical Islamist ideas since July 2017 and advocated the ideology of the terrorist organization Islamic State, or ISIS. By November 2018 at the latest, he had been considering an attack in Germany. And in the spring of 2019, according to the indictment, the accused repeatedly informed himself intensively about the construction of bombs in a chat group with ISIS supporters. It was about plastic explosives, package and magnetic bombs, Kalashnikov assault rifles and submachine guns. In August and September 2019, the 29-year-old is said to have bought chemicals such as acetone, hydrogen peroxide solution and sulfuric acid, substances needed to manufacture the high explosive triacetone triperoxide or TATP. And I'll see you in my next video. Bis gleich.